All right, can I be seen and heard?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
I think it's pretty telling that Amrit couldn't name who the alternative leader of the Likud party would be if Netanyahu wasn't the leader of it. There is no credible alternative. This is actually the centrist coalition that she described. It is certainly the most centrist in Israeli politics, which is notoriously right-wing. And that is why I think this debate is very, very clearly going to fall to upbench, but specifically to OO. Because the problem is the credible alternative is not some sort of centrist yet pro-Arab party or coalition in Israel. It was never going to be like that. That is not how Israeli politics works. This was the centrist alternative. It was far better than Benjamin Netanyahu's government, and that was likely to be the real counterfactual, right? Amrit is correct. It is likely that another election would be called and elections would be consecutively called. But what would actually happen there is not that you would get a mystical centrist coalition that somehow was composed of different parties. The only party she named that isn't in this coalition was Joint Scroll, which was never going to join because of the fact that they were like an Arab party who had never agreed to form government, had made that clear in their politics and made that clear in their policy. So obviously what happens then is that the centrist coalition is not a viable counterfactual. That is actually just what did happen. You have to accept that this is the best you can do for centrism in Israel. The only counterfactual then in this debate that is realistic and even remotely feasible is that Benjamin Netanyahu would have returned to power, because eventually somebody would have crumbled and said, you know what, sure, corruption is terrible, but so is having 10 elections and no budget and no healthcare system functioning. That is what would have had to have happened. So because of the fact that Netanyahu has hollowed out Likud in such a way that there is no credible alternative that anybody can name in this debate, because of the fact that he was consistently weakening the state, because of the fact that he was stoking tension against the Palestinians and against any other Arab forces in the region. So what that means then is that at the end, you do not have any alternative except for Benjamin Netanyahu, who's obviously more right-wing than this guy, which is far better. The fact is, you have to deal with a world in which either you have further elections for another year, another 2 years, you have a further weakening of the state, because as long as Netanyahu is able to remain a sort of premier by default in that interim period while elections are happening, that means that there will be more attacks on the Department of Justice. It means that there will be more attempts to hollow out the state because of the fact that all of this is in an effort to prevent himself from being tried for corruption charges. Note that it's not like the trial has begun or anything like that yet. It still has to happen, and at least this is a way in which it can happen. But if you kept just calling elections, that is more and more opportunity for this corrupt leader to continue to protect himself from any potential lawsuit, from any potential trial. If you just keep going without a budget alone, that is enough to do things like hamstring police forces, hamstring investigators and departments of prosecution, etc. And it was worse, obviously, for the most vulnerable people in that region, because this isn't just like, oh, the government couldn't do a formal thing governments need to do. That formal thing of creating a budget was imperative for having things like a healthcare system, which was obviously crucial in COVID, for having a functioning education system, which was more important for the Arab residents in Israel, more important for the poorest people there as well. It looks like continuing the push into West Jerusalem purely to stoke those tensions in order to justify a further hollowing out of the state, a further centralization of power in Netanyahu, and a further insulation from any sort of potential consequences from the mass corruption that he was conducting in the state. That was a disaster. That counterfactual was horrible, and they needed to grapple with that instead of making this claim that there was some sort of mythical coalition of centrist parties in Israel that were also going to be pro-Arab. It was just never going to happen. They didn't exist. So let's then talk about why this is actually a very good coalition that will get relatively better things done than the alternative would have. The first thing to note is that this is an incredibly large coalition. It contains the first ever Arab party to ever be in government in Israel. It is the most perspectives within the party room, or the tent as it were, ever, which sounds like it will be, it could be unstable. I'll get onto that in a second, but it's important to note that just this variety of perspectives is really crucial in terms of doing things like dealing with the problem of how do you manage Arab citizens within Israel? How do you manage Palestine? Because at least having an Arab party in the room was far better than having no Arab party in terms of offering sympathy, in terms of offering hope that those negotiations could actually be fruitful. The second thing to note, though, is that despite this being a very large coalition, it is also likely to be a uniquely stable one, because of the fact that these parties were even able to come into the same room in the first place is indicative of how high that level of commitment is to just anything other than Netanyahu for another 5 years, right? The fact that these guys are willing to talk to each other is an incredible level of commitment. And note that it is so clear the alternative is Benjamin Netanyahu or somebody even worse, some protege that might exist theoretically within the Likud, right? So obviously then at that point, you are terrified for at least the next 2 years of this coalition collapsing, because that will result in a new election, and that election potentially returns Netanyahu. You're unlikely to be able to finish that corruption trial process quickly because of how incredibly detailed and how much corruption occurred, et cetera, which is why then you had to just have at least some policies getting done in the meantime. This maybe was not going to be sweeping reform, but it was never going to be sweeping reform in Israel. It probably at least looked like restoring the healthcare system, restoring education, things that really mattered for people on the ground, including Arabs within Israel, including the most poor Israelis. And that was really, really important, especially in a world where we're dealing with COVID. And note how terrible the fact that these elections kept happening were when it came to dealing with an Israeli COVID response. Vaccines are thankfully beginning to happen, but things like being able to enforce lockdowns, for example, could not happen because you could not do things like empower police officers or empower public health officials to create policy when a government didn't exist that could pass those necessary laws. So that is why this is particularly imperative, but also why these things that could get done, which were obviously things that like even these incredibly disparate parties could agree on, right? Like everyone can agree that you do need to have these lockdowns in at least some areas. Everyone could agree that you do need to at least restore the health and education systems to what they used to be. Even if you couldn't reform them per se, at least they could function again. And that was a huge win as well. The final thing to note here is that at least everyone in this coalition, the fact that they are together, it is indicative of the fact that they all can agree that they think that Netanyahu and the corruption that he perpetrated was horrific, which is why this is a coalition that maybe will not get sweeping reform in terms of healthcare or education or other types of like sexy public policy things, but probably could do a lot of really meaningful setup of anti-corruption measures, because these were all parties that had a reason to be suspicious of each other and the coalition that Netanyahu used to head. They could probably agree that having things like a very impartial justice system was important, because that was something that they could all agree on, and it was something that they thought was going to make everyone adhere to the rule of law, which is something that is a win for everyone in that coalition. That was incredibly important. The final thing to talk about is the fact that this is also the best hope for Arab rights that we have had in Israel since its foundation. That is obviously a coalition that is left of Netanyahu's, right? Like that is clear in the info slide, if nothing else. But also it's important to understand that Likud was actually to the right of Netanyahu, which is why any potential successor is going to be worse. Whereas this coalition is to the left of Naftali, which is why it is likely that he will actually be pulled more in the left. So you shouldn't care too deeply about the statements he's made in the past or his personal involvement. He is hampered by this coalition because he is in the most right-wing bit of it. He cannot be worse than those statements, but he is far more likely to be much better than them. So this is obviously going to be far better than Netanyahu or far better than any sort of potential reformed Likud. And that is why I think we clearly win this debate.
I thank the speaker for that speech to further the case on opening government DPM.
Matt, I think you need to stop the recording.
The first question that I'm going to address in this debate is, what does counterfactual look like? Because opening government gives you two separate counterfactuals, which is kind of proof that they don't really know what this government would look like. Firstly, they tell us, well, it would actually be this like great centrist coalition of like various different great parties that would come together. It would be, I believe they said, a combination of Yair Lapid, blue and white, and joint list. Obviously not going to happen. Firstly, for the reason that Joint List has never been invited to be part of any government because it's a dominant Arab party. It's the third largest party in Israel. And the kinds of things that they stand for are things that are anathema to the vast majority of voter base in Israel, considering particularly the fact that Arab voters are disenfranchised very significantly and not a significant part of the electorate. They will never be allowed to form a coalition. That is a great way to get your government killed immediately. The remaining parties do not have nearly enough votes, noting, for example, that Likud plus its further right-wing allies, who Netanyahu has moved further right to pander towards over the years, control 59 out of the 120 votes in that body. It is unclear where all these additional votes are coming from if you abandon like the ones that already exist as part of this coalition here. So that explains why that centrist coalition is not possible. The second counterfactual they say is actually it's Likud, but it's just better because you've gotten rid of Netanyahu. That is obviously not going to happen for a couple of reasons. What are the reasons they tell you to believe that this one is possible? They say, well, they'll replace Netanyahu with Gideon Saar, who is like splintered off, and he's the opposition leader. Firstly, if he's not in the party anymore, it seems a bit silly to claim that he would be the leader of the party. Secondly, obviously, the fact is that Likud is Bibi. They're not going to like separate from Bibi. He is the party. He's led them for 12 years consecutively. He led them before that very successfully for a 4-year term. He has hollowed out the party infrastructure and installed all of his people throughout it. Like, interestingly, both Bennett and Yair Lapid were former assistants of Netanyahu. He is the dominant force in Israeli politics. You don't just like get rid of him. It's not Australian politics. That shit doesn't fly, right? But thirdly, they're like, oh, well, he'll be indicted and therefore he won't be able to run. Firstly, no, he won't. He's hollowed out the justice system literally for the last 2.5 years, specifically for the reason of avoiding indictment. But secondly, that is exactly one of the reasons why you should not oppose this government. One of the first things they will do is they will make it such that you cannot run for office if you're currently under indictment for corruption. That means that the worst case scenario for us is presumably that counterfactual, right? We would just ban Bibi from running again and we would get that friendly Likud party if the worst case happens for us and this party sort of fractures immediately or whatever, which means that that basically knocks out their counterfactual. The likely thing they have to defend is probably Netanyahu getting back into power. The worst case we have to defend is the thing they wanted to defend. That gets us over them. Let's explain though why it is very likely that we do get a relatively stable government. We give you a series of reasons for this. Firstly, Israel has been in flux for over 18 months. They really don't want to go through that shit again, which is why the voters will punish people if this coalition breaks up, which is exactly why Bibi has gained seats every time, not lost them. He got to 59 this time. It's about as close as you can get without winning, right? Like, it's logically not possible that he had less seats in previous occasions. Secondly, he has a plurality of seats right now, so obviously he is the dominant party, right? But secondly, because the interests of all the other parties are to avoid Bibi returning, he is the dominant force in Israeli politics. They have to keep him out. They will not risk breaking up the government. And that is why, for example, Bennett has come out and said this will be the government of compromise. That is why Bennett has come out and said that there will be a power sharing agreement. That is why Bennett has come out and said, like, we agree. We have really different opinions on a lot of things. That is why we're going to focus on the things that we all agree on. We're going to focus on the fact that we need to fight COVID-19. We're going to focus on the fact that we need to put together a budget that doesn't try and do ambitious reforms or anything, because that's where disagreement might occur. It will make sure that the infrastructure of the state can function. It will make sure that the Justice Department actually can do its job because it's not full of Netanyahu cronies. We will make sure that people like the poorest citizens in Israel, often Arab citizens, are able to access basic services like welfare and not being evicted from their homes and so on. All of that stuff is far more likely to occur. Lastly, why will you not like betray them after 2 years? Obviously, that's a great way to get yourself like turfed out of office permanently. The voters don't want to go into another flux of elections or anything prematurely. That is a way to lose the election in a huge form. So obviously that means we get like a far better form of stable government. Let's then address the second thing they want to talk about, which is a peace process. This is truly perhaps the most ridiculous set of claims I've heard in a debate to date. What do they tell us? Firstly, they say, well, the PLO won't want to negotiate with, Bennett, but they will with Bibi. Firstly, like, no, the PLO is literally a useless organization. Abbas has overstayed his fucking term by like 17 years now or something. No one in fucking Palestine believes him. He has no legitimacy. He has no capacity to negotiate on behalf of anyone. Unclear how that affects the debate at all. But secondly, Hamas will never negotiate with anyone. Like, one, that's kind of their whole shtick, is not negotiating. And two, obviously, no Israeli party combined of any parties is ever going to give them anything they want. The whole point of negotiating when Bibi does it is that you kind of like delay things so that you can go and fuck them over again. And as Beach points out in the POI, that has been his playbook, right? Like, the way Bibi gets into power is he tells people, you need to be scared. There's a threat. There are missiles coming over the fence. And the Iron Dome can't protect you, only I can. That is why he always does try to expand settlements. That is why he is incredibly aggressive. Their only response here is to say, well, Bennett is worse. Well, look, maybe Bennett's worse, maybe Bennett's better. That's like a question of fact that probably can't be adjudicated in this debate. The question is, who has the capacity to be worse? Is it Netanyahu, all of his allies to the right of him, or is it Bennett, part of a coalition where everyone is to the left of him? Obviously, the answer there was Bibi. I'll take closing.
Sure. How has the Arab League responded to changing power?
They haven't done anything because their whole point, the whole way they operate in Israeli politics is they get like a bunch of votes, refuse participation in anything. The rest of the parties kind of like crack down on Arab voters, and then nothing changes and nothing ever will change there. Like, unfortunately, there's not going to be peace in the Middle East. There's not going to be like, a solution to those problems. If you want to run your extension on that, like, have a good time or something, knock yourself out. So at the end of all of this, what do we get? on the issue of peace, we tell you, look, there probably won't be a grand solution, but there will not be the escalation of tensions that occur. Why will there not be an escalation of tensions under Bennett? Because that is the easiest way to lose votes, right? That's the BB strategy. When people feel scared, they go to Netanyahu. You don't want to do that if you're the opposition to Netanyahu, so you will not do that. There won't be things like corruption. Why? Because that's the easiest way to get rid of Netanyahu. There won't be things like no budget for another 18 months. There will be things like the provision of basic services. There will be things like a stable government that can actually get things done. So at the end of all of that, we tell you that this is far, far preferable. You ought to support the side that is able to actually get the basics of governments done. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. To start off the closing half exchange, member of CUF.
I don't.
Country with an extraordinarily successful healthcare system, a strong economy, and that has broadly managed to extremely effectively enforce the law in spite of a lack of budget. There is one important imperative in this debate, which is that we are currently going through the third infidata, and there is very little indication that it is going to cease in the opposition's world. The question in this debate is a narrow one about who is able to reduce the violence that Israel perpetrates against the Palestinians. And in order to demonstrate that this would be a backward step in that goal, I'm first going to analyze why Naftali Bennett became the leader in the first place, the circumstances that put him there. I'm then going to describe the intermediate period, the election that everybody in this debate agrees would probabilistically happen afterwards. And then I'm going to describe why the best case scenario leads to a leader that is virtually identical to Bennett, and the worst case scenario is that it leads to somebody much worse. Why is Naftali Bennett the leader? The crucial thing to understand about coalition formation is that it is inherently on slim margins, because the more inclusive you are with your coalition, the more compromises you need to make. And as has already been acknowledged in this debate, obviously, there is a large amount of diversity already in the coalition. And the next people the coalition formation guys would have needed to go to would have been ultra-Orthodox parties, which then would have been almost but potentially reconcilable with the Arab group that has been included in the formation there. The reason that this is quite important in this debate is because it is likely that if, as opening government describes, there was another election and then they got more, like the sort of like left centrist coalition was able to get more seats, that would then most likely lead to the ejection of that Arab party from the coalition and the formation of a coalition on a very similar 1 to 2 vote margin, because the differences are already so big that it is implausible that coalition negotiations would occur without that. As a result, you need to give maximalist incentives in the circumstance in which you're attempting to form a coalition to the rightmost party in a left-wing coalition. And the reason for that is simply that they are the ones with the least to gain by being in that government. They have a credible option, like they could credibly go and join Likud as a coalition. They could credibly demand things, whereas nobody else in the coalition would be able to do that. And they're also more ideologically inclined to do so. That is the reason that Bennett was given the prime ministership in the first place, because it was the only mechanism to induce him. And everyone in this debate has ignored the reason that Israel went through 4 elections that yielded no governments and then a 5th one that did. And it's that Bennett changed his mind and chose to ally with parties that he is incredibly ideologically inhospitable to. And the reason that he was willing to do so was because he was offered the prime ministership. The second question then to ask is what happens when you go into another election? The first thing to say is that Benjamin Netanyahu would remain the caretaker prime minister, as happened the past 4 times. Dom's response to this explains why he tabbed much worse than me at Wills. It was that no, Bennett would become the caretaker prime minister. But the thing is that the caretaker prime minister is the incumbent. The motion is that we regret the fact that he became the prime minister, which means that in order for that to have occurred, he must have become the prime minister, then immediately called an election, which is obviously and trivially a ludicrous state of affairs. What is Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy for pursuing re-election? It is the same thing that he has done the past 4 times, and that has in his mind a reasonable prospect of success. Double down on the base of Likud and the turnout amongst ultra-Orthodox voters by inspiring an enormous amount of hot conflict in Palestine and then bombing them extraordinarily aggressively in order to project strength. It is important to understand that Seamus's probability calculations in this debate, even if you believe them, are still probability calculations. Whereas this is almost certain. He literally would be the caretaker prime minister. He literally has done this every single time before, and it is currently not happening. There is obviously currently a conflict, there is bombing going on, but it is different because it was not exclusively inspired by a random political statement by the incumbent prime minister that meant that it was designed to inspire a conflict in order to get the election. Like, it's important to delineate between types of Israeli violence. Some of it is because a large portion of Israel's military and culture believes they need to do things to defend themselves. And part of it is because Benjamin Netanyahu does it when he's the caretaker prime minister in order to win votes. You get rid of that second one. So that's the first devastating harm in the bank. Secondly, there is a risk that he wins re-election. Now, opening opposition, the thing to basically say is that opening government's claims are very, very nebulous here. They're like, they were losing votes. That's true, Likud is losing votes. Ultra-Orthodox parties were gaining votes. The sizes of the coalitions weren't changing that much. The difference here wasn't the size of the relative coalitions. The difference here was Bennett's unique choice, right? There is a risk that the election could go a little bit differently. We know that elections are unpredictable and it could be returned, which pretty much everyone in this debate has conceded is the worst case scenario. Secondly, the opposition's response to this is that they'll replace him. Now, there's been a lot of analysis given, but it's falsified by the simple fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is currently the opposition leader of Israel. If it is true that they perceive him as a stinker who can't win an election, why haven't they replaced him yet? The answer is that they don't. They still think that he is the best chance for them to win re-election. I'll conclude by talking about why, if another person got it, the prime minister would probably be Benny Gantz, who is a catastrophe. But before I get there, closing. Oh, sorry, Amra.
Okay, so closing government knives us with their counterfactual, which you need to deal with. And if it's true that the rightist wing party has the most power, our analysis that Bennett will leave in 2 years and will be super strong and move right wing because of the incumbency bias happens. So your government is way more right wing than Netanyahu is, if that's the worst case.
Yeah, I think I do agree. Like, closing government's absolutely knife to you guys. That's why I'm not talking about them that much. However, this analysis that you provide about how Bennett is going to leave in 2 years is kind of odd. Firstly, he would retain the defense ministry, which is very attractive to him. Like, that's the deal when he leaves. Yeah. And secondly, he would obviously be totally burned because he's not going to be able to form a coalition with Likud anymore. They'll probably delegate, like, they'll probably force the party to eject him, right? But also, so he's not really got any part there. Finally, Benny Gantz is the next cab off the rank. So if the coalition expands inside and they eject some other people, the most right-wing party is blue and white. Benny Gantz has every single harm that Naftali Bennett has, right? He is the former leader of the IDF, right? Do you think the PLO is going to be more likely to work with him? Do you think that he's going to be better for normalization efforts? Do you think that he is going to be perceived better in any of these ways? The absolute best case scenario for the opposition is they have an 8-month interim period in which Benjamin Netanyahu continues setting Palestine on fire, and then we get someone who is virtually identical to Bennett. This is a terrible idea.
I thank the speaker for that speech. To sum up the case on closing government, Kavip.
Can you just pass me that?